I want to reinforce the advice that undertaking your migration project is way beyond just a lift and shift. And I want to emphasize the importance to everybody here that you need to make sure a lot of things happen before, during, and after your migration. And really, this work that we're going to be talking about in today's webinar is relevant no matter the size of your Microsoft 365 migration that you're undertaking. By performing some of this upfront work that we're going to be talking to you about, you will have created some realistic, clear objectives. You're going to be able to understand the various stages of the migration process and what work needs to happen in each stage, from pre-work to the discovery, to the planning and prep needed, to the execution of both the Delta and full migrations, to the testing and post-migration activities. And lastly, fundamentally, we really want our users to love the destination Microsoft 365 system they're migrating to. And this needs to be facilitated by a strong adoption, change management, communication, and training program through the process of your entire migration. In my career at Creospark, we've completed hundreds, if not thousands, of migrations, everything from clients that have just started the process of adopting Microsoft 365 from a different provider to clients who have already adopted Microsoft but are going through a digital modernization project. Now, these migrations we have done really encompass every type of migration, including small or enterprise scale migrations, migrations with simple or complex metadata and folder structures, legacy SharePoint on-prem server migration to SharePoint Online, and modern SharePoint Online to SharePoint Online migrations, as well as classic to modern. We've also done migrations that aren't document and metadata related. For example, digital modernization migrations to Microsoft 365 for project management, task management, your email, your Exchange, your calendars, enterprise social to Viva as well. And lastly, not just from SharePoint as the source. We at Creospark have migrated from Dropbox, Box, Lotus Notes, FileNet, OpenText, tenant to tenant, Microsoft 365, file shares, and a lot more. And although 80% of what we're going to be talking about today is relevant on any document migration, today we're going to be concentrating on what it takes to migrate your documents and associated metadata to Microsoft 365, which encompasses OneDrive, Teams, SharePoint Online, Modern. And we're particularly going to concentrate on the source of your migration being file shares or any version of SharePoint, whether it's legacy on-prem, online, classic, modern, or a tenant-to-tenant. Now, let's be clear, for whichever type of migration you are doing, you're going to run into small and not small issues. And in our case, we have expertise in overcoming all sorts of challenges and optimizing our incomes. But we have learned some tips and lessons that I want everybody on this webinar to find, and hopefully it'll help you overcome some of these issues. And there are lots of lessons, and what we're kind of doing here is a brain dump from myself and my team. And so you could take it in stride and choose the ones you want to employ during your migration. At a high level, before you start your projects, the first thing you need to do is have that clear vision, which describes what's important to you in your migration and how your objectives will be achieved and how you'll measure them. Make sure that the focus of everything you're doing is on your core business and your destination is catered to what your business specializes in and what is relevant to your employees. Next, you need an intuitive organization with fresh, engaging, accurate documents and content. And we call this information architecture that you're going to be able to see throughout this webinar, that concept. Your content needs to be organized in a way that makes it easy for your users to find what they are looking for. Whether they're searching for it, whether they're browsing for it, it doesn't matter. We need to organize our destination, which is at Microsoft 365, to optimize our employee productivity. We want to reduce clicks. We want to personalize it so employees can get to what they need quickly. We need to understand and organize our personas and stakeholders involved in our migration and those that are going to be using our destination. Designating champions for each business unit is a great way to understand the changes and the usage of how they're using it right now. We also want to have a task focus, knowing that we're going to be providing access and tools and content to help people get their jobs done. The data and information which we're going to be providing to our users are going to be informing the key business decisions, and they're going to inspire new ideas at your organization as well. People need to know that they can trust the content from a security and compliance perspective, and everybody needs to understand their responsibilities and that the proper stakeholders are accountable for their documents and content. So we're going to be able to need to define the tools on which should be used by when and whom. This is where governance, security, and compliance comes in. Now, we also want to make sure our search works great, and we need to start the planning for everything that we've heard over the last little while with AI, chatbots, and copilots. This includes ensuring our content is organized and correctly tagged in a way which makes our content and documents and metadata easily found. And with this, we also need to ensure that our bad, redundant, out-of-date data is minimized. And this involves a cleanup, which we're going to be talking about in a bit. Now, many organizations are coming to us and they're telling us that, hey, we need to do a migration, we need to digitally modernize, but we want a like for like on our existing source systems to Microsoft 365. But we found that in most cases, this is not entirely possible, as there are many factors and considerations that may and should impede this. A like for like or a lift and shift migration often leads to missed opportunities for optimization. Sometimes they lead to misalignment with what the business is looking for in the new systems, and probably a missed opportunity for you as an organization to modernize your users' cloud infrastructure and processes, and in turn, workplace productivity. We don't want garbage in and garbage out in the new systems, and that's why it's an important exercise to define and decide what you want to do with your ROT, a very common term used in migrations for redundant, obsolete, and trivial content and documents. Now, if you have regulatory compliance policies in place or a retention schedule, you'll probably need to store and archive your data in some manner. This is where this could be in Microsoft 365, but it doesn't need to be there. You need to think about this. And if this content is going to be constantly accessed, you will most likely need to migrate it, but this might not apply to all types of content. You need to consider the strategies for all of this. Now, other aspects you need to think about during your migration are embedded hyperlinks in your content, your PDFs, your Word documents, or linked Excels. You need to ensure they work once they're migrated to the new system. But in the end, you need to focus not only on the technical reasons for the migration, example, an infrastructure architecture upgrade, but migrations are a big opportunity to improve the overall employee experience. This includes a better onboarding, better communications for the whole organizations, your goal settings, their task management, and collaboration amongst all of your employees. If you lead on these points, the adoption of Microsoft 365 will follow. And everybody, when you're doing this, everybody's going to ask, what's in it for me as part of this migration? And if you don't address this, in the end, you will have failed in your migration because nobody wants to use your destination system and nobody knows the benefits of the new system. Again, the what's in it for me question that all of your users are going to ask. Now, when we are chatting with our clients about a migration engagement, or in fact, any engagement, these are the key pillars we kind of break it down to from a high level. We stress that these are all important pillars that are required to be undertaken and considered throughout the entire engagement. And we're going to be talking about this throughout this webinar. The desired business outcomes and employee experience should really drive the information architecture and everything else. Your information architecture, or IAs, you'll hear me call it throughout this webinar, governance, security, and compliance are so much more important with the rise of Copilot as well. If you don't do the upfront proper planning, your Copilot deployment will expose flaws in these areas really, really quickly. Now, when you're migrating your documents and metadata to Microsoft 365, the information architecture you're migrating to is one of the most important aspects you need to consider. Designing the target state information architecture for future state document management in Microsoft 365 is that critical step that needs to be done before we start migrating, as it's important to design a system with organizational and departmental alignment with how your employees use it. Your IA is going to define how your data will be organized and how content is classified and accessed in the new environment. It's going to impact the performance, scalability, and user and employee experience. It's critical for ensuring data integrity and security and compliance. It needs to be intuitive with fresh, engaging, accurate documents and content, and allow your teams and SharePoint sites to behave as your employees expect. It's going to enable your employees to find what they came there to do and to optimize their productivity. It should be able to reduce their clicks and ideally be personalized so that they can get to what they're looking to do really quickly. It also defines how your users are going to interact with the structure to complete their tasks. It involves creating the navigation, the search architecture, the site hierarchy, taxonomy, security, teams, channels, site collections, libraries, content types, metadata, and a lot more. So when you're creating your information architecture, you need to make sure it's centered how your business currently works and how your employees work. And before migrating documents from any source to your newly conceived information architecture, you need to look at all of these aspects we just talked about. And by spending a great amount of upfront effort in your information architecture, you can improve things like user adoption, user satisfaction, workplace productivity, employee experience, and all the while reducing your IT costs, information overload for your users, compliance and bad information risks on top of security. Now, when you're migrating from SharePoint, which is usually more complex and offers that advanced content management and collaboration features, and then file shares, which usually have that hierarchical structure, there's many gotchas for both types of migrations. For file shares, as an example, falling back to our previous information architecture discussion, normalization and simplification of your future state in Microsoft 365 is an extremely important exercise to go through, and careful analysis is needed on your file shares. For example, in your file shares, we've been used to creating subfolder after subfolder as our default way of finding and categorizing our files. It's more of a browse mentality rather than a search. These subfolders are probably best suited in some cases as metadata in columns and libraries when migrated to SharePoint. So consider this when creating your destination information architecture. If you've been working with file shares for years, you've probably had hundreds, if not thousands of actions taken on your files and folders. This may include having many different versions of files that people, according to their own processes, rename them with a dash date or a dash v1 inside it. Obviously, in SharePoint, we now have version control. So that happens automatically. So decisions need to be made on the versions of the files within your file shares. You also need to focus on the sharing and permissions on your folders and files. It's very important to understand the ACLs and securities that have been applied on those folders and files. This is usually done for file shares by your IT department. So you're going to need to talk to the business and IT to find out if this security is needed and account for it in your future state information architecture. Now, hopefully, there is a mechanism there which you can simplify the security as well. And another consideration which tags along to that is the concept of security groups. Have these groups been synced from your Entra if you're doing an on-premise to online migration? Have they been synced to your Entra ID? And are you going to be using Microsoft 365 groups or security groups, dynamic or static? A lot of times database files, very large files, media files, and source codes are stored in file shares as well. But some of these should not be uploaded to SharePoint Online as a best practice, and especially if they're frequently being accessed and changed consistently. Do your research on these file types and don't do that lift and ship. Figure out what repository makes sense the most for those types of file types. Now, there's also some file type, path length, character limits that are allowed in file shares, but not in SharePoint. Furthermore, during your migration, you might run into some other issues in your file shares, such as locked files that can't be accessed, people actively moving, deleting, and changing files. And you may have some sort of legacy infrastructure where network drive speeds and performance limitations may impact you, especially with throttling and everything that goes on. Now, file shares may actually be linked to a P or a personal drive on your network file share. Now, these may be mapped to a drive ladder on people's devices. These are great candidates to migrate to OneDrive, but they still need the same attention as the rest of the shared drives that may go directly into Teams and SharePoint. So follow the same process, whether you're migrating to Teams, SharePoint, or OneDrive. Lastly, there's a need to identify which files and folders map to your future state information architecture as OneDrive files, as Teams channels, private or shared, team sites, communication sites, document libraries, home and hub sites, hub attached sites, and of course your content types and metadata. This all needs to feed in your future state IA planning. But a great first step for your file shares is talking to each business unit, understanding their method to their madness of organizing the source you're migrating from, whether this is a file share or SharePoint. And a lot of times they'll just tell you that this structure has been inherited from someone else, and they don't want to change it for fear that other people may not be able to find stuff. Talking to the business and getting business alignment will lead to creating a simple, intuitive future state structure in an IA in Microsoft 365 and increase your chances of a successful migration. Now, these are just some of the considerations of migrating your file shares, and many of them apply to SharePoint, but SharePoint brings a host of other considerations when you're moving from SharePoint to SharePoint, whether on-prem or online to SharePoint Online. That includes throttling CPU and memory limits, enterprise metadata such as content types and term stores, classic to modern migration impacts, your user experience impact because of doing that, space limits, data volume, user access patterns. We're going to be touching upon these SharePoint considerations in the upcoming slides from a migration aspect.